Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today I want to complain about AMD blocking multiplier adjustment on the 5800X3D. And the reason why I say blocking multiplier adjustment and not like completely disabling overclocking is because it is very hard to disable overclocking on the AM4 platform. After all, I made a video overclocking a Ryzen 5 3600 on a A520 motherboard, a chipset, which definitely shouldn't be able to overclock, but the thing is, you can change the BCLK on A520 motherboards, and therefore you can overclock on A520 motherboards. So really, all AMD has managed to do is block the multiplier adjustment on the 5800X3D. They've also said, like, oh, we're going to disable voltage control, but that is actually not within their capabilities. And the reason that is not within their capabilities is because the CPU does not contain the voltage regulator for vCore. It contains voltage regulators for things like VDDG and VDDP, but it does not contain the voltage regulator for vCore. The voltage regulator for vCore is on the motherboard, and the way this works is the CPU requests a voltage from the voltage regulator on the motherboard, and the voltage regulator may or may not decide to provide said voltage to the CPU. And so you can't actually prevent voltage adjustment on a motherboard, like not with a Zen CPU. I guess what AMD could maybe implement is have some way of detecting that the voltage is outside of what they expect, and then the CPU shuts down on you. But other than that, there really is no way for the CPU to block a voltage adjustment, because that's handled externally by the motherboard. Really, the only CPU I can think of with locked voltage only CPUs I can think of with locked voltage control are Intel CPUs with the integrated voltage regulators. Because with the integrated voltage regulator, like if Intel doesn't give you access to the integrated voltage regulator, well, you can't change the voltages that it's generating. And since the integrated voltage regulator is literally built into the silicon of the CPU, there is no physical way to access it and adjust it because it's in the chip. So yeah, so that's kind of the only CPUs I can think of where voltage control can actually be reliably locked down. And in fact, on 12th gen non-K CPUs, the VCCSA voltage is actually locked. You can't adjust VCCSA. But anyway, the point is, because Ryzen doesn't have an integrated vCore regulator, AMD can't stop you from changing the vCore. But what they can do is they can stop you from changing the multiplier, because the multiplier is circuitry built into the CPU, so there's not really any physical way to fiddle with that. And so, yeah, so they can block the multiplier, and the whole point of blocking the multiplier adjustment is that it makes it very inconvenient to overclock the CPU, therefore discouraging voltage adjustment, therefore minimizing the probability that somebody accidentally blows their CPU up. So that's why they're doing this, is apparently the thing is they've not given, like AMD has basically said that the 5800X3D, like it doesn't really scale past 1.35 volts, or like it doesn't, like it does, like that it already uses like the full safe voltage range from the factory, which is up to 1.35 volts. Now, we don't know if this is because the cache layer is significantly more fragile than the, rest of the CPU, like the extra cache layer, because the extra cache is more dense, so maybe it's more fragile. Or because the chip just runs insanely hot, because the 5800X3D is not one continuous piece of silicon, it's 4 pieces of silicon, right? You have the 3D cache, well, you have like the base layer with the cores, you have the 3D cache, and then you have 2 filler pieces of silicon to basically level out the space where the 3D cache isn't. And so the thing with this is, like, I'm assuming that because this isn't one continuous piece of silicon, the thermal properties of this chip have to be absolutely horrendous. And consequently, it runs really hot. And now the thing about hot running small transistors is that they don't scale with voltage very well. Like, the main reason most modern, basically anything modern that doesn't scale with voltage very high is because it has thermal issues. Which is, well, yeah, like it just has thermal issues. So a Ryzen, like 5000 series Ryzen already suffers from that. If you have, like, say, a 5950X or something, it is very hard or actually, basically at some point, relatively early, if you're running multi-threaded workloads, you're going to hit a voltage past which more voltage doesn't give you any further frequency improvement because the chip is just too hot internally. So the 5800X3D logically probably hits that point way sooner because it's not one continuous piece of silicon, it's 4 pieces of silicon. And so I'm assuming this is primarily a thermal issue with the CPU and not a I'm assuming that the transistors on the 3D cache die aren't actually that fragile. But even then, 1.35 volts on a good piece of Ryzen 5000 silicon would potentially do 4.5 all core. Like, not 1 point, like it wouldn't do 4.5 boost, it would do 4.5 all core. And so, and to prove that, let's pull up some hardware bot statistics. For the regular 5800X. And what are we going to... I want a very heavy workload. So like X265 is a good option, or Y-Cruncher. Where's Y-Cruncher? That. I guess 2.5 billion would have been also an alternative. Anyway, so this is obviously on liquid nitrogen, and I am also kind of annoyed that 5800X3D on LN2 is... We're probably not going to see that. Or actually, maybe we will see that. Like the people at Asus ROG are absolutely insane. So I wouldn't be too surprised if they just BCLK overclock the 5800X3D on liquid nitrogen anyway. But yeah. So on water cooling, H26 like hardware bot X265. This is a 4K video encoding benchmark. It is very heavy. Right, like these people are hitting anywhere between like 4.6 and 4.8. If we go for AIO water cooling, we've got 4.5 to 4.8. Air cooling, we've got 4.7. If we go with stock, okay, we've got 4.6. Wait, are you kidding me? Are the only people on HardwareBot running these CPU? Oh, I guess it's because I chose a benchmark that most people don't really run very much. Anyway, then we have Y-Cruncher, which is basically... This is basically LinPack, the benchmark. It's very, very similar to LinPack. And if we go for ambient cooling methods like air cooling, there's people running freaking, Y-Cruncher at 4.5 gigahertz all core. Right? So, and what voltage is this at? Oh, man. Okay, the voltage readings are bugged out, as always. Up to 1.31 volts. Yeah, like, Ryzen doesn't scale past 1.35 volts in general. I have no idea how the 3DV cache is special. It's like the whole reason AMD... Because, I watched the interview, and it was like, yeah, so our normal boost system goes up to, 1.5 volts. Yeah, because you're running one core at 5 gigahertz. But for all-core workloads, you can't go up to 1.5 volts. The chips get entirely too hot. Like, my 5950X doesn't scale for Cinebench past, 1.3 volts load. Load voltage. It's actually one of the most frustrating things with overclocking my 5950X when I'm in, some CPU benchmark is it's crashing, and then you raise the voltage, and it crashes sooner. Because it gets even hotter and less stable consequently. And so, we already have this behavior. I guess with the 5800X3D, it would be to an extreme degree, and a lot of people might not be, might not realize that this is what's going on, but this isn't new. Nvidia GPUs do this too, to some extent. Right? And you don't see Nvidia restricting clocks. Mostly because Nvidia actually controls their board partners, so they can prevent people from, giving you voltage adjustment. But point still stands, that's a different issue for a different video. But yeah, I can understand that the CPU is more fragile and probably thermally a disaster. And so overclocking on this thing would be very different from regular Ryzen CPUs. And, maybe most people should be prevented from doing that. Maybe. I don't know. I feel like, they could have Actually, you know what's really... this has just hit me. When you overclock a Ryzen CPU, it disables the thermal limit. Like, normally on a Ryzen chip, right, once you hit like 90... well, basically, once it starts going over 90 degrees, the precision boost system starts really pulling back the clocks and the voltage. And this continues up until 95 degrees, which is like the hard limit. At 95 degrees Celsius, the chip will just not, like, it will just keep dropping clocks pretty much indefinitely in order to stay at 95 degrees. And I just want to check if this is also true for the 5950X. Yeah. So, because I don't have a 5800X, I have a 5950X. And it will go up to 95 in certain workloads, but once it hits 95, like, it will just keep lowering the clocks until to stay at 95 degrees, because that's like the hard thermal limit for the boost system. And then the thing with this is that if you manually overclock a 5950X, this temperature limit goes from 95 degrees to 115. And so if we consider overclocking the 5800X 3D in the context of how badly implemented overclocking on AMD CPUs is, manual multiplier overclocking is on AMD CPUs, it's like, yeah, okay, that's probably not ideal. You know, if you're able to get we have a CPU that's probably incredibly difficult to cool if you start fiddling with the voltages manually, and AMD has a thermal cutoff at 115 degrees Celsius. And what I mean by thermal cutoff is at 115 degrees Celsius, the CPU shuts down. It's no longer like, oh, it's going to throttle. No, it just shuts down completely. And so the thing is, one way this could have been easily solved, in my opinion, is they could have shifted the 5800X 3D where when you manually overclock it, it switches to like a 90 degree thermal cutoff or an 85 degree thermal cutoff, where it just shuts down at 85 degrees Celsius so that you can't damage it. Or 80 degrees Celsius. Like, they could have set the thermal... Like, there are ways around this that don't involve blocking the adjustment of the multiplier. Right? And so I am very annoyed by this. Especially since they didn't actually block overclocking, they just made it super inconvenient because, you can just do it with BCLK. Also, Scatterbencher is a great YouTube channel. You should check them out. But yeah, like, it's just dumb. It's just really, really dumb. Like, this is an enthusiast class product. And honestly, if they made a 5800X 3DK edition with that was more expensive and had worse stock settings so that, normies would be disincentivized from buying it. As in people who don't want to overclock their CPUs would be disincentivized from buying it. And people who don't know how to overclock their CPU would be disincentivized from buying it. I'd be happy to pay for that. If it was if it was as expensive as a 5950X, came with worse stock clocks, or even without precision boost, entirely no precision boost, right? Like, imagine that. The chip, that thing would be terrible at stock settings. You would have no other choice but to overclock it. Yeah, so if they offered something like that, I would be totally down to get it. But instead, it's just kind of admittedly, it doesn't really make a ton of sense for AMD to offer two CPUs where one of them is super niche and not really that popular. Like, that would arguably be a waste of manufacturing resources. But the other option was to just implement the 5800X 3D with a much lower thermal cutoff when in manual overclocking mode. Because the standard manual overclocking mode thermal cutoff is 115 degrees Celsius. And so if some part of this chip is more fragile, and also this chip just seems to be thermally it's probably thermally way harder to cool, then logically we should just lower the thermal cutoff. I really don't see how this was the only option. They could have made it really difficult to overclock this CPU by, implementing a bunch of very hard safety limits. Mostly in the temperature department, because and I would have been totally down with that, if there was a super hard thermal cutoff or something. But instead, it's just you know what, no overclocking. I'm really annoyed by this. Especially because like the 5800X3D doesn't pull a lot of power, right? And so this would have been a really interesting CPU for messing around with like questionable subambient cooling systems. Because the thing is, like, you know, Intel has that Peltier water cooling block for their CPUs. And to me, that is a stupid idea because Peltier cooling a 300 watt CPU is just like, this is terrible. Because Peltier's, like, if you want to cool a 300 watt load with a Peltier, you need like a 600 watt Peltier to do anything. Like if you want to be doing anything more than wasting your time, but a 176 watt load or a 200 watt load, right? Like the kind of power consumption that a 5800X3D could hit, like you could deal with that like on a 400 watt Peltier. And so this would, like, to me, this was the kind of CPU where it was like, oh man, I was planning like dodgy subambient cooling solutions for this because this doesn't produce that much heat. It just runs really hot because it's thermally, you know, like it has a very high thermal resistance. And AMD is just like, you know what? No, we're just going to make it a very boring CPU. It doesn't even run that hot. Admittedly, this isn't like this is just Blender. But yeah, I just think this is really dumb. Like there was so many ways that they could have. Well, I don't even think there's like so many ways. Like they could have literally just set the thermal limit really low as soon as you change the multiplier. That would solve it. Is like the CPU just shuts down if you change the multiplier and it goes over 85 degrees or something. That would act as a much better voltage limit than what, like, because the thing is they can't actually stop you from changing the voltage. The only thing is like they can just stop you from changing the multiplier. And so I am very annoyed. Very, very, very annoyed. Because, like, this is one of the most exciting CPU releases in a very long time. You know, no stupid-ass E-cores, more cache. Awesome. Like, this is potentially like a single-threaded, memory-limited workload, like, monstrosity of a CPU. And then AMD's like, yeah, and we're going to make it extremely boring. And it's like, yeah, like... So, well, thank you AMD for saving my wallet though, because I'm just not gonna buy this. It's really that simple. Yeah. Hopefully, like maybe we'll see. Well, I don't know, because the thing is, I think it would be cool if the Asus ROG team ran one of these chips on liquid nitrogen with just stupid BCLK. On the other hand, there might not be any point to doing that because like pretty much the only benchmark where well, actually for Y-Cruncher it could be interesting because Y-Cruncher is like a really hard 3D Vcache versus DDR5. I wonder about that. I really wonder about that. This is like a really hard memory benchmark. Same goes for SuperPi. Actually, SuperPi would be really interesting. Because this benchmark is very memory intensive, but it doesn't really, I don't believe it uses a ton of RAM. So this is one of, like, this might have fit in the L3 cache. So yeah, there's like quite a few benchmarks where it's like this CPU could have been incredibly interesting. If you had manual overclocking support. And these are single-threaded. Like this you're not going to cook the chip on fucking SuperPi. Like this, and it's just, yeah. And AMD's over here like, you know, no. Super normie-ass gaming CPU. That's what the 5800X3D is. And I am extremely disappointed by that. So, anyway, that's it for this video. I just really, really wanted to rant about the 5800X3D, partially because like AMD said, like in the interview with Robert Hallock about the 5800X3D overclocking, they said like they're blocking voltage control, which is like, no, they can't. Like, I know for a fact that they can't do that because it's not built into the freaking CPU, so you have no, like, you know, like, that's why, like, there's offset voltage registers. Freaking Gigabyte B450 motherboards glitch out the voltage reading so hard that you don't actually have a voltage reading on those motherboards when overclocking manually. So I have no idea how they were planning to block the voltage control, considering how the motherboard has way more control over that than the CPU ever will. And so it's just like the blocking the ratio, like, yeah, I get that. That'll basically prevent anybody from messing with the core voltage, because there's no point if you can't change the frequency. But man, I'm so annoyed by this. And like, I still think they could have just implemented a lower thermal shutoff point. You know, as soon as you start messing with the CPU ratio, they could have just implemented a really low, safe thermal shutoff point. I don't know, maybe that wouldn't have been good enough, but to me that would have been good enough, you know, because that would have still allowed anybody who, you know, wants to mess with, like, you know, full-blown subambient cooling setups, right? Like, look at how many people ran the 5800X on LN2, and, you know, like, these are the kind of people that are annoyed that you can't overclock this thing. It's people like me, you know? Most people buying CPUs have a hard time turning on their XMP profile. I really don't think we need to be preventing those people from adjusting their CPU ratio, because they probably can't find the setting. So yeah, I am very annoyed by this, as you can probably tell. Anyway, there, that's actually it for this video. Oh man, that ended up being way longer than it needed to be. But yeah, like, just AMD sucks. Like, they're doing this to their GPUs, now they're doing this to their CPUs, and it's just like, I've never been so annoyed in a very long time. So yeah, I guess, sorry for wasting your time. Like, share, subscribe if you feel that your time hasn't been wasted. You can also support the channel. I've got a Patreon. There's a Teespring store. There's I have Teespring store, which has, you know, like, YouTuber merch, and then there's also the Bandcamp that I have for my, like, solo industrial metal project thing. So if you'd like to check out any of the, like, Patreon, Bandcamp, or Teespring to support the channel, that would be much appreciated. And that's it for the video. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.